In 1422, England's warrior king Henry V died at the height of his power. The conqueror of Agincourt left behind a baby barely 8 months old, the sole heir to 2 thrones. That infant, Henry VI, would grow up not as a soldier but as a saintly dreamer, destined to wear his father's crown yet never his armor. His story is one of inherited glory turned to national collapse, a reign that began with the union of England and France and ended with civil war and ruin. Today we trace the full life of Henry V's only child, his birth, upbringing, reign, downfall, and the short, tragic line that ended with a teenage prince on a battlefield. This is not legend or drama. It's the true account of how England's most celebrated dynasty of the Lancastrians died out in 2 generations. On December 6, 1421, at Windsor Castle, Catherine of Valois gave birth to a son. The child was named Henry after his father, who was campaigning in France when word reached him of the heir's arrival. King Henry V had secured his dynasty's future, but he would never see his son walk or hear him speak. 8 months later, on August 31, 1422, the great warrior died of dysentery at Vincennes, leaving his infant son as King of England and, by right of conquest, heir to the throne of France. The baby Henry VI was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on November 6, 1429, when he was 7 years old. 2 years later, he received his second crown at Notre Dame in Paris, becoming the only person ever crowned king of both England and France. Yet these ceremonies were mere pageantry masking a fundamental weakness. England now had a child ruler in an age that demanded military leadership. The reality of government fell to a Regency council dominated by Henry's uncles. John, Duke of Bedford, served as regent of France, attempting to hold the conquered territories through military might and diplomatic alliance. At home, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, acted as Lord Protector, though his authority was constantly challenged by the powerful Cardinal Henry Beaufort, the young king's great-uncle. These men understood that they governed not in their own right, but as stewards of Henry V's legacy. The burden of that legacy was immense. Henry V had died owning half of France, with Paris under English control and the Dauphin reduced to ruling from provincial bourgs. English commanders held Normandy, Maine, and much of northern France through a network of fortified towns and loyal nobles. The infant king inherited not just crowns, but an empire that required constant military and financial support to maintain. Yet even as the Regency struggled to preserve Henry V's conquests, cracks began to appear. The English treasury, drained by decades of warfare, could barely fund the garrisons needed to hold French territory. French resistance, initially scattered and demoralized, began to coalesce around new leaders who questioned the legitimacy of an English child wearing the crown of France. The boy king's minority would last 16 years, during which his father's great achievements slowly unraveled. The education of Henry VI was designed to produce a king worthy of his father's memory, but it created instead a scholar more suited to the monastery than the throne. His tutors, led by Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and later by John Somerset, emphasized classical learning, theology, and moral philosophy. The young king mastered Latin, studied the works of Augustine and Aquinas, and developed a profound personal piety that would define his character throughout his life. Unlike his father, who had been trained from childhood in the arts of war and statecraft, Henry VI showed little interest in military affairs or the harsh realities of royal power. Contemporary accounts describe a gentle, bookish child who preferred prayer to practice with sword and shield. Where Henry V had been decisive and commanding, his son was thoughtful and hesitant. The very qualities that might have made him an exemplary monk made him unsuitable to rule a warrior kingdom. The contrast with his father became more apparent as Henry approached his majority. Henry V had been physically imposing, personally brave, and ruthlessly practical in pursuit of his goals. His son was slight of build, deeply religious, and more concerned with the salvation of souls than the conquest of territories. The young king founded schools and colleges, endowed monasteries, and surrounded himself with clerks and scholars rather than soldiers and administrators. This difference in character reflected the changed circumstances of Henry's upbringing. Where his father had learned kingship during the turbulent reign of Henry IV, fighting rebels and usurpers, Henry VI grew up in relative peace under the protection of his regents. He never experienced the formative struggles that had shaped previous generations of English kings. The skills needed to win a throne were not the same as those required to keep one. Henry's personal devotion manifested in grand architectural projects that became his lasting legacy. In 1440, he founded Eton College near Windsor Castle as a school for poor scholars. The following year, he established King's College, Cambridge, as its sister institution. These foundations reflected his belief that education and piety were the highest royal duties. The resources devoted to these projects might have been better spent on the defense of France, but Henry prioritized the spiritual welfare of his subjects over territorial ambition. By 1437, when Henry was declared of age to rule in his own right, the pattern of his reign was already established. He would be a king who governed through others, preferring to retreat to his books and prayers, while favorites and factions struggled for influence. The warrior's son had become a saint, but medieval England needed a warrior more than it needed sanctity. When Henry VI assumed personal rule in 1437, he inherited a kingdom stretched beyond its limits. The English position in France, maintained through 20 years of regency, depended on continued military success and diplomatic unity. Henry's gentle nature and preference for peace over war would prove catastrophic for England's continental empire. The first crisis came from an unexpected source, a peasant girl from Domremy named Joan of Arc. In 1429, she had convinced the Dauphin Charles to allow her to attempt the relief of Orléans, which had been under English siege for months. Her success in breaking the siege marked the beginning of French recovery. Although Joan was captured and burned by the English in 1431, her impact proved lasting. She had demonstrated that English arms were not invincible and had inspired a generation of French resistance. By the 1440s, the French had developed new military tactics that neutralized English advantages. Artillery trains could reduce English-held fortifications more quickly than relief forces could arrive. Professional companies of cavalry and infantry proved more effective than the feudal levies that had dominated earlier campaigns. Most importantly, a new generation of French commanders, trained in the hard school of defeat, had learned to avoid the pitched battles where English longbowmen had previously dominated. Henry's response to these challenges revealed his fundamental unsuitability for the demands of medieval kingship. Rather than personally leading campaigns to restore English fortunes, he delegated military command to nobles whose competence varied widely. Rather than demanding the taxes necessary to fund proper defenses, he accepted parliamentary grants that proved inadequate. Rather than cultivating the alliance with Burgundy that had made English conquest possible, he allowed diplomatic relationships to deteriorate. The turning point came in 1449 when the French launched a coordinated assault on Normandy. English resistance collapsed with shocking speed. Rouen, the capital of English Normandy, fell after a brief siege. One by one, the towns and castles that had anchored English power for a generation surrendered or were stormed. By 1450, all of Normandy was back in French hands except for Calais, which would remain English for another century. The loss of France had immediate consequences for Henry's rule in England. Soldiers and administrators who had built careers in the conquered territories returned home seeking compensation and employment. The Commons and Parliament demanded explanations for military disasters and questioned the competence of the king's advisors. Popular unrest, exemplified by Jack Cade's rebellion in 1450, reflected widespread anger at royal failure and misgovernment. Henry's response to these crises demonstrated his fundamental inability to provide strong leadership. Rather than taking personal responsibility for the loss of his father's conquests, he retreated further into religious observance and scholarly pursuits. Real power gravitated toward court favorites like William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, whose policies had contributed to the French disasters. The king who should have been a warrior had become a figurehead, while England drifted toward the chaos that would engulf it in the coming decade. In 1445, Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou, daughter of René, Duke of Anjou, and titular King of Naples. The marriage was arranged as part of a diplomatic effort to secure peace with France, but it brought Henry a queen whose forceful personality would dramatically reshape English politics. Margaret was everything Henry was not: ambitious, decisive, and willing to use royal power to achieve her goals. The marriage negotiations revealed Henry's continuing weakness in statecraft. As part of the agreement, he secretly promised to surrender the county of Maine to the French crown. This concession, made without parliamentary approval, represented another step in the dismantling of Henry V's conquests. When the terms became known, they provoked outrage among the English nobility and commons, who saw the surrender as unnecessary and shameful. Margaret quickly established herself as the dominant partner in the royal marriage. Contemporary accounts describe her taking active roles in council meetings, promoting her favorites to positions of authority, and defending royal prerogatives against noble criticism. Henry, by contrast, seemed content to allow his wife to manage the practical business of government while he focused on his religious foundations and charitable works. The birth of Edward of Westminster on October 13, 1453, should have secured the Lancastrian dynasty for another generation. Instead, it coincided with a personal catastrophe that would destroy Henry's remaining authority. In the summer of 1453, the king suffered what contemporaries described as a complete mental breakdown. He became catatonic, unable to recognize people or respond to questions, effectively removed from any participation in government. The timing of Henry's collapse could hardly have been worse. The final loss of English territories in France, except for Calais, had occurred earlier that year with the defeat at Castillon. England had lost the 100 Years' War decisively, ending more than a century of cross-channel empire. The financial and political consequences of this defeat required strong royal leadership at precisely the moment when Henry became incapable of providing it. Margaret found herself in an impossible position. As queen consort, she had no constitutional right to rule in her husband's name. As mother to an infant heir, she had every incentive to preserve Lancastrian authority against potential challenges. Her attempts to maintain royal power during Henry's incapacity would bring her into direct conflict with Richard, Duke of York, who had the strongest claim to serve as protector during the king's illness. The royal family's domestic arrangements reflected the broader dysfunction of Henry's reign. While the king retreated into illness and religious meditation, the queen assumed responsibilities that medieval custom assigned to the monarch himself. Their son Edward, born into this unstable environment, would grow up knowing his father more as an invalid than as a king. The family that should have embodied royal authority instead symbolized the breakdown of effective government. Henry's mental collapse in 1453 created a constitutional crisis that would trigger 3 decades of civil war. For more than a year, the king remained in a catatonic state, unable to recognize his newborn son or participate in any aspect of government. Parliament was forced to appoint Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector, effectively admitting that the Lancastrian monarchy had failed. York's appointment as Protector represented more than a temporary expedient. As a descendant of Edward III through both his father and mother, York had a claim to the throne that many considered superior to Henry's. His administration during the Protectorate proved more effective than Henry's personal rule had been, managing royal finances more successfully and restoring some measure of order to government. When Henry recovered his sanity in early 1455, York's reluctance to surrender power created the first open confrontation between the houses of Lancaster and York. The Battle of St. Albans on May 22, 1455, marked the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. The engagement itself was brief and small-scale, more of a skirmish than a proper battle, but its political consequences were enormous. York's forces killed several prominent Lancastrian nobles, including Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, Henry's chief advisor. The king himself was wounded and captured, though York treated him with careful respect, maintaining the fiction that they fought against the king's evil counselors rather than against royal authority itself. Margaret of Anjou refused to accept Yorkist dominance over her husband and son. Her response to St. Albans demonstrated the determination that would characterize her role throughout the civil wars. She built a Lancastrian power base in the north of England, cultivating support among nobles who feared York's ambitions. Her willingness to use violence to protect her family's rights marked a decisive escalation in the conflict. The next 6 years saw England descend into intermittent civil war as the two sides struggled for control of the king and government. Henry, when lucid, proved incapable of providing the strong leadership that might have reconciled the competing factions. His periodic relapses into mental illness created recurring power vacuums that encouraged further violence. The gentle king who had sought to rule through Christian charity found his kingdom torn apart by battles fought in his name. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461. Fought during a snowstorm in Yorkshire, it was the largest and bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War period. The Yorkist victory was complete and devastating. Thousands of Lancastrian nobles and soldiers died in the battle and the pursuit that followed. Henry, Margaret, and their son Edward were forced to flee to Scotland, effectively ending the first phase of Lancastrian rule. Edward, Earl of March, son of Richard of York, was proclaimed King Edward IV on March 4, 1461. For the first time since 1399, the crown had passed outside the direct Lancastrian line. Henry VI, who had inherited two kingdoms as an infant, now found himself a landless exile dependent on Scottish and later French hospitality. The warrior's son had lost everything his father had won. The decade of Henry's exile tested the loyalty of those who had served the Lancastrian cause. Edward IV proved an effective king, restoring royal finances, maintaining order in England, and building diplomatic relationships with European powers. By contrast, Henry's court in exile struggled to maintain relevance or attract meaningful support for a restoration attempt. Margaret of Anjou proved more resilient than her husband in adversity. While Henry retreated into religious contemplation, she worked tirelessly to build coalitions that might restore their son's inheritance. She traveled between Scotland and France, negotiating with anyone willing to support the Lancastrian cause. Her determination kept the dynasty alive during its darkest period, though her efforts often required compromises that damaged her reputation in England. The opportunity for restoration came from an unexpected source: the quarrel between Edward IV and his former ally, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. Known as the Kingmaker, Warwick had been instrumental in placing Edward on the throne, but their relationship deteriorated over foreign policy and the king's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville. In 1470, Warwick allied with Margaret of Anjou and Louis XI of France to launch an invasion that caught Edward unprepared. Henry's restoration in October 1470 was as dramatic as his deposition had been. Edward IV fled to Burgundy while Warwick's forces occupied London and released Henry from the Tower of London. The former king was brought to Westminster and formally restored to the throne in what contemporaries called the readeption. After 9 years of exile and imprisonment, Henry VI was king again. The restored Lancastrian government faced enormous challenges from its first day. Henry's mental state remained fragile, requiring continued reliance on others for actual governance. Warwick and Margaret remained mutually suspicious despite their alliance, competing for influence over royal policy. Most importantly, Edward IV retained significant support in England and was actively preparing his return with Burgundian assistance. The readeption lasted only 6 months. Edward IV landed in Yorkshire in March 1471 with a small force but quickly gathered supporters. The decisive battle came at Barnet on April 14, 1471, where fog and confusion led to Warwick's defeat and death. Margaret of Anjou, arriving from France with reinforcements, was defeated again at Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. Her son Edward of Westminster was killed either during the battle or immediately afterward, ending the direct Lancastrian line. Henry's second deposition was final. Edward IV had learned from his earlier mistakes and was determined to eliminate the Lancastrian threat permanently. The aging former king was returned to the Tower of London, where he would spend his final days in captivity. The brief restoration had demonstrated that while some Englishmen remained loyal to the House of Lancaster, the dynasty lacked the strength to maintain power against determined opposition. Henry VI's final imprisonment in the Tower of London lasted less than 3 weeks. On the night of May 21, 1471, he was found dead in his cell under circumstances that immediately aroused suspicion. The official cause of death was given as melancholy and displeasure, but contemporary sources widely believed he had been murdered on the orders of Edward IV or his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The manner of Henry's death reflected the brutalization of English politics during the Wars of the Roses. Earlier medieval kings who had been deposed, such as Edward II and Richard II, had also died in suspicious circumstances, but Henry's case was particularly stark. He posed no personal threat to anyone, being both mentally fragile and politically powerless. Yet his continued existence remained a potential rallying point for future Lancastrian conspiracies. Edward IV's decision to eliminate Henry demonstrated a cold calculation that had been absent from earlier phases of the Civil War. The new king understood that mercy toward defeated rivals was a luxury he could not afford. Henry's death marked the final transformation of what had begun as a dispute over royal counselors into a struggle for the physical survival of competing dynasties. Henry was initially buried without ceremony at Chertsey Abbey in Surrey. The contrast with his father's magnificent tomb at Westminster Abbey could hardly have been more pronounced. Where Henry V lay surrounded by the symbols of his military triumphs, his son was interred as quietly as possible, his burial intended to close a chapter in English history rather than commemorate royal achievement. Yet Henry's death did not end his historical significance. Within decades of his murder, stories began to circulate about miracles performed at his tomb. Pilgrims started visiting Chertsey Abbey to pray for his intercession, particularly for the healing of mental illness and the protection of scholars. These popular devotions reflected a growing recognition that Henry, whatever his failures as a king, had been a genuinely holy man. In 1484, Richard III had Henry's body moved to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle and placed in a tomb near the high altar. This relocation may have been intended to associate the Yorkist dynasty with Henry's growing reputation for sanctity, or perhaps Richard felt genuine remorse for his family's treatment of the deposed king. The move certainly enhanced Henry's posthumous reputation and encouraged the cult that would eventually lead to formal proposals for his canonization. Henry VI died as he had lived in his final years, as a victim of forces beyond his control. The gentle king who had sought to rule through Christian charity became the most prominent casualty of his kingdom's descent into violence. His death on May 21, 1471, marked not just the end of a reign, but the extinction of the direct male line of Henry V. Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales, was born into a dynasty already in decline. His father's mental illness, which began in the year of his birth, meant that Edward would grow up knowing more of political instability than royal power. As the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, he carried the hopes of the Lancastrian cause and the burden of a family reputation that had been tarnished by military defeat and civil war. The prince's early childhood was spent largely in exile. After the Lancastrian defeat at Towton in 1461, Margaret fled to Scotland with her 7-year-old son, beginning a decade of wandering that would take them from the Scottish court to the French royal court and various noble households that supported their cause. Edward's education was necessarily irregular, conducted by whatever tutors his mother could secure in their temporary refuges. Unlike his father, Edward showed early promise as a potential warrior king. Contemporary accounts describe him as physically robust, politically astute, and eager to reclaim his inheritance through force of arms. Margaret ensured that her son understood his position not as a mere refugee, but as the rightful heir to the English throne, temporarily displaced by usurpers who could be defeated and punished. The prince's marriage negotiations revealed the international dimensions of the Lancastrian cause. In 1470, as part of the alliance that would restore Henry VI to the throne, Edward was betrothed to Anne Neville, daughter of the Earl of Warwick. The marriage was intended to cement the unlikely partnership between Margaret of Anjou and the man who had originally helped depose her husband, demonstrating how political necessity had overcome personal animosity. Edward's wedding to Anne took place in December 1470 at Amboise in France, shortly after his father's restoration. The 17-year-old prince finally seemed poised to play an active role in reclaiming his family's heritage. He participated in planning the military campaign that would defend the restored Lancastrian government against Edward IV's expected return from exile. The end came swiftly and violently at the Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471. Edward fought in the Lancastrian front line, demonstrating the personal courage that his father had notably lacked. When the battle turned against the Lancastrians, the prince was either killed in combat or captured and immediately executed. Different accounts give varying details, but all agree that Edward of Westminster died on the battlefield, aged just 17. With Edward's death, the direct male line of Henry V came to an end. The prince, who might have restored Lancastrian fortunes and reversed his family's decline instead, became the final casualty of his grandfather's achievements. His death at Tewkesbury ensured that Henry V's bloodline would not survive the civil wars that had consumed England for a generation. The extinction of Henry V's direct line in 1471 did not immediately end Lancastrian claims to the English throne. The broader Lancastrian dynasty continued through collateral branches, most notably the Beauforts, who descended from John of Gaunt's liaison with Catherine Swynford. It was through this connection that Henry Tudor would eventually claim the crown as Henry VII, though his genetic link to Henry V was distant and complex. Henry Tudor's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 marked the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, but his claim to legitimacy rested more on conquest and marriage than on clear hereditary right. By marrying Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, Henry sought to unite the warring factions that had torn England apart for 3 decades. The union symbolically ended the Wars of the Roses, though it did so by creating an entirely new royal line rather than restoring the old one. The transformation of Henry VI's reputation provided a counterpoint to his political failures. Within a generation of his death, he was widely regarded as a martyr king whose sanctity had been proven by his suffering. Several attempts were made to secure his canonization from Rome, though these efforts ultimately failed due to political considerations rather than doubts about his personal holiness. Henry's architectural legacy proved more enduring than his political achievements. Eton College and King's College, Cambridge, survived the civil wars and flourished under subsequent dynasties. These institutions became models for English education, their Gothic revival architecture serving as lasting monuments to Henry's vision of royal responsibility. The annual ceremony of laying flowers at Henry's tomb on the anniversary of his death continued well into the Tudor period. The irony of Henry VI's historical position became apparent only with the passage of time. The king, who had lost his father's conquests, proved more successful as a founder of educational institutions than as a military leader. His colleges would educate generations of English leaders, including many who served with distinction in later wars that Henry himself could never have imagined winning. The last connection between Henry V's bloodline and royal power came through Catherine of Valois, Henry VI's mother. After Henry V's death, she had secretly married Owen Tudor, a Welsh squire in her household. Their grandson, Henry Tudor, would claim the throne partly through this connection, though the legitimacy of Catherine's second marriage remained questionable. In this indirect way, Henry V's widow provided the genetic link that brought the Tudors to power. By 1471, less than half a century after Agincourt, Henry V's great victories were memory alone. His only son had died a prisoner, his grandson, a boy, cut down on the field. The warrior's dynasty ended with a scholar king whose gentleness could not hold a realm of iron. Yet in the quiet courtyards of Eton and King's College, his name still endures, a faint echo of a world that once believed one man's crown could unite 2 kingdoms.